Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight, all of you seated here and all of you seated above. It's wonderful to have this opportunity. Also, I want to welcome the people who are going to watch this online in the days to come. I particularly want to thank Sarah. Sarah thanks so many people who made this possible, but Sarah is the one who's brought this together and has got so many more events during the year. Sarah, thank you very much. It takes kind of a courageous individual to agree to be on a panel after a group of people listen to what Ken Burns produces on the screen. But we have a very courageous group tonight. Their backgrounds are in the brochure, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it as I go through the conversation. I want to get right into it, however, because honestly, I'm sure watching what you've just watched, you realize that if we tried to unpack all the messages there and think about both what was faced in our past and what we are going to confront going forward, we'd be here for hours and hours, if not days. And we've got about 30 minutes. We might run over a little bit. You know, one of the things that I thought about as I saw this is that we have with us one of the really great historians of this entire region, if not the country, in Pete Lesher. And I thought Pete, who's at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, member of the Talbot Council, he serves and is engaged in a leadership role in so many ways. I thought I'd ask Pete to kick it off because one of the takeaways I had, Pete, was here's something that began this notion that Franklin had of creating some kind of a union in the mid-1700s. And then 20 years later, the idea really took shape as the frustrations began to crystallize with the British. There's a lot of discussion about what was happening throughout this young nation that was being formed at the time, but I'm kind of curious, and I hope maybe you would give us a little context for what was happening on the Eastern Shore and around the Chesapeake Bay at this time, and then what that suggested and meant as the revolution took shape. So you can kick it off.
Well, Talbot County was a farming economy. It was a rural place, a place that was that had really just one principal town, one town of any consequence whatsoever, and that was the trading port of Oxford. Easton really doesn't grow up until right about the time of the Revolution. And of course, the Revolution would be disastrous for Oxford because they lost their collector of customs and we didn't have to have vessels check in anymore. And Easton grows up, Oxford declines. But this is a place, even though this is an agricultural economy, it's a relatively prosperous place, at least for the propertied members of society. And it's a place that produced people who were in the leadership, people who were carrying forward those Enlightenment ideas, who would draft the Talbot Resolves, a response to the closure of the port of Boston, who carried these revolutionary ideas forward to the Maryland legislature and to the Continental Congress. In fact, the president of the Maryland legislature was a Talbot Countian, Matthew Tillman, who also would become a member of the Continental Congress. And the name may not be familiar because he was not one of Maryland's four signers. He, for reasons we probably don't have time to get into and that we can't actually know, he never signed. But this is fundamentally an agricultural place with that degree of prosperity for some.
Tim Boyle, who is the founder of Vintage Books and Fine Art, has also, as he shared with me, studied the American Revolution for many years. And, you know, Tim, so much of what we saw tonight was based on the words and phrases of the names of people, most of whom we know. But clearly there were people writing and sharing thoughts during this period right here on the Eastern Shore. the name Tillman comes up from time to time, as do others. And I just wondered, in terms of your research and your special focus on literature and writing, what was happening in this area around that time with regards to those who shared their thoughts through written material, books, articles, and that sort of thing?
Well, I think a lot of it was relayed in the newspapers of the time, and a lot of those authors were intentionally anonymous, and they wrote under pseudonyms so as not to be accused of treason and so forth. And many of those ideas, which originated here on the shore and also in Annapolis, led to actually tremendous events here in Talbot County. It wasn't really discussed in the 30-minute excerpts from the Ken Burns series, but if you watch the whole series, you'll see he spends some time on the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, and that was really the beginning of the steps towards revolution. And one of the most important parts of that Stamp Act crisis happened right here in Talbot County. What the Stamp Act was it was an act passed by the British Parliament, which required stamps to be put on all kinds of documents, playing cards, dice, and this was basically a tax if you had to deal in anything related with paper, newspapers also. You had to pay this tax, and so stamp distributors were appointed for every colony, and there was one appointed for the colony of Maryland. His name was Zachariah Hood, and he was actually landed here in Talbot County, in Oxford, because Oxford was the primary port on the Eastern Shore, on August 18th, 1765, and word had gotten to Talbot County before he arrived, and when the ship was called the Layton, and it was captained by one of our very own patriots, Jeremiah Banning. He did that before he opened up the restaurant across the street. There was a violent crowd which was ready to hang Zachariah Hood if he accepted this appointment. And Jeremiah Banning got out of the situation by explaining to the crowd that he had no idea that Zachariah Hood was on the boat. And so he got out of it, but Hood, he made a clandestine escape, and he made his way to Annapolis, where he was greeted with the same fate. These protests were extremely violent, and Talbot County, at least here in the state of Maryland, was a central part of that through that crisis. So much of those ideas, much of the words written, not only here, but across the colony, were spread like wildfire across the colony, and so we reacted accordingly.
You know, Catherine Cat DeShields Moon is, I believe, a fifth-generation member of your family living in this region, and it's remarkable. You are very much involved in a museum in Bellevue that talks about bringing people together, and I wondered, as you saw this and you saw how these young states or communities were brought together to form a union. I wonder what went through your mind, because I know you think about that. What binds people together? What brings people together?
Oh, thank you. And I'm a growing historian, which means I'm in my toddler phase where it's like, yay, sweet stuff, ooh, veggies. So forgive me if I don't get all the dates correct. But if you have any time or inclination, please watch the entire series. It's magnificent. And there's no way that 31 minutes does it justice. There was a lot of feels, and I was in my feels for a lot of the series, but one thing that continued to ring true, and I found to be true in my own lived experience in Bellevue and in Talbot County, is that the spirit of the striving for something that might not be within your means to provide, something, an ideal that you hold true, but may not know how to actualize on your own power, but maybe with the help of others willingly, some unwillingly, some by force, by choice, you come together and there's a way that you're somehow magically something greater than yourselves individually. And I think that's the biggest thing that I took away from watching this documentary series is and I'm going to butcher the quote, but all of these different people that are, might fight and argue and not get along, came together for something that they believed that was bigger than themselves, and that was liberty. And liberty, I think, could mean a lot of different things depending on who you ask, what time of day you ask, what's going on in our current socio-political climate. It could change, but the spirit of togetherness and looking out for fellow man is something that really resonated through the entire narrative through line for this series. And it doesn't mean that it was nice, neat, and like a lovely kumbaya moment. There was some very hard conversations and arguments and back and forth and iterations that had to happen. It wasn't a done and dusted, oh, that was nice and neat. And I think that was a huge thing for me was, being younger, it's like, oh, the American Revolution, yeah, they just got in a room and they figured it out and boom, 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 and it was done. And it was not that at all. And in Bellevue in particular, that spirit lives on in terms of we are a very connected, diverse group of people. And the sense of place, the sense of home that we have is tantamount. And we do a lot to connect with each other and preserve the beautiful landscape that we're able to call our home. And, that continues to this day, not just in Bellevue, but in so many places across the United States. And in watching this documentary series, I hope that we could all get back to there's something that we all can share. And if it's not red blood running through our veins, it's being proud of the place that we identify as home.
That's a great thought. Pete, I want to build on that because I've heard you talk. We've talked about how there's something about the Eastern Shore and the communities here where they're up and they're down and they're back up and down again, and they evolve, they change, they find a way forward. Particularly a place like St. Michael's, where we've spent a lot of time with the Maritime Museum. Do you think that came from, sort of was forged in this revolution that we lived in, or why do you think that is? That there's a resilience that seems to be here that maybe isn't in other places?
There is a resiliency, and we spend some time documenting it, talking about it with respect to the waterman's culture around here, which famously gets knocked down by both the natural cycles of the fisheries and oyster diseases and what ails the rockfish, and but also by regulatory challenges. And yet this is a culture that knows how to pivot, that knows how to adapt, that remains stronger in Talbot County than it does anywhere else. We've got more working watermen here in Talbot County today than in any other jurisdiction in Maryland. And it's not just the watermen, of course. I think we do see that in our culture. You reference St. Michael's and its ups and downs. Here's a town that grew up really after the American Revolution. They laid out the streets on the eve of the American Revolution, but the company that was doing that and that was selling the lots was in Scotland. And so that did not work out very well for a few years. And it really grows up after the Revolution as a shipbuilding town and thrives that way. But then when we don't need ships after the War of 1812, after Napoleon gets sent into exile, it declines. The town government ceases to function, and the town reinvents itself in the mid-19th century as a seafood harvesting town. Our waterman's culture, as we all saw, that too went through a decline in the mid-20th century. And if it were relying on that waterman's economy, seafood harvesting, seafood packing, there wouldn't be much left in St. Michael's today. But St. Michael's again reinvented itself, really as a project of Talbot County. How are we going to backfill that employment? And invented a tourism and hospitality industry that allowed the town to want it. So that you see this sort of resilience in across Talbot County, across professions, the watermen, others. It is something that is certainly very much present among us.
You know, Tim, to state the obvious, people were coming together with, as Kat points out, disagreements, but a sense of urgency about joining together. But we didn't have email or Instagram or all the other. So communication really was in the form of articles and books and lectures, I guess. But how did they communicate? How did they spread these viewpoints so successfully from, Boston, Philadelphia, throughout the Eastern Shore?
It's an excellent question. As tensions rose and the legislatures of each colony began to grow more and more independent, the colonies, as they were in the process of splitting with Great Britain, as they began to operate on their own, they created two different bodies. Each colony, each town, each state capital, they had two things. They had committees of safety and they had committees of correspondence. And generally speaking, the committees of safety ran the politics, the technicalities, the things that had to get done in the colony would be handled by the committee of safety. In terms of communication, the committees of correspondence handled all that. And when things happened, such as the arrival of Zachariah Hood, or here in Talbot County also in 1774 with the Talbot Resolves, all these happenings all throughout the colonies, there would be an entire network of people on horseback going here, going there, spreading the word from town to town to town, from colony to colony. And that's how things got around. And if you take a look at the Talbot Resolves, those were, as the sign says, out there in front of the courthouse in 1774. And many colonies, many towns had similar resolves, and they were all to support the town of Boston after the British government, as Pete had alluded to, closed the port of Boston, which was one of the intolerable acts of 1774. And we know that it happened. There are no extant copies of the Talbot Resolves. We don't even know if they were ever printed, but we know about it because of a newspaper article in the Maryland Gazette. And so these committees of correspondence would pass the word around, and the articles would get printed in newspapers, and that's how people knew about things.
That was an Annapolis newspaper.
Right, that's correct.
So
yes.
Word was getting back and forth.
Yes, correct.
And when, so this is fascinating. In doing this, and I know obviously there was a lot of debate at the time. We saw that, we heard about that. But did real strong consensus emerge as these thoughts were shared and circulated, or was there a lot of ongoing debate throughout the period of the Revolution?
Oh, there was always debate, yeah. There was never a majority of people in favor of independence. Before the war, throughout the war, there was people who were diehard patriots, people who were diehard loyalists, and then there was the others in the middle who would switch, depending on who occupied where they lived or where they worked, they would kind of switch their loyalties.
So, Kat, you mentioned the notion of the hope of people working closely together and engagement, at the risk of dragging us into some current day kinds of thought. Let's go beyond that. I mean, what is it that helps bring people together and keep them together on a common cause or common purpose? I know that's happened in Bellevue. I know it happens in around Talbot County. I sometimes take hope from what I see locally far more than what I see nationally, because I think locally there you do reach more consensus. But what's your thought on that?
So I think you got to have people in the room first, and that doesn't mean that everybody has a seat at the table, but word gets around, right? And using Bellevue as an example, the few dates that I do know, like it wasn't until the late 1800s with the Valiant Canning Company that Bellevue, what we know it to be, is agricultural like on the water support, or a resource hub rather, is when that all started. But the thing that has always been there, at least through the 5-6 generations with my kids being in Bellevue, is that we know each other's names, and if you're cutting up on the corner, the news gets home before you do, and you're going to get whooped by everybody in the neighborhood, not just your parents. And that it's one, knowing what's happening in your neighborhood, but also on the wider scale around you. You can't just kind of insulate and like put your head in the sand, because then you're only getting pieces of a nuanced conversation that may impact you in different ways. But just knowing who your next door neighbor is, being willing to have difficult conversations. So one of my grandfather's neighbors had a bunch of cats, and his passion was making sure that they were neutered or spayed so that there wasn't like this huge cat epidemic in Bellevue. And Pop hates cats. He thinks they're demon spawn. So that was just like an ongoing, and it's so trivial, like now that you think about it, but they talked about it. They would come on the other side of the fence and be like, keep your cats on that side of the fence. It's like, whoa, how am I exactly supposed to do that? So having difficult conversations, knowing who your neighbors are, giving a damn, pardon my French, when somebody is having a hard time. Whether it's cooking a dinner, making a phone call, just checking on people. And before you know it, like all of the things that you could point to as to why you're different or don't understand or you're this and I'm that disappear into just a spirit of, I see you and I want to help you, because we don't agree on everything, but there's a lot that we're okay with. And I love Bellevue for that. If you ask me, if you ask my dad, if you ask my grandfather, it was like, when we leave here, we're never coming back. Ever, ever, never, never. And we went and we did, to different states and schools and whatnot, but we came back because there is something about this place. And a large part of it is the connections that you formed. I mean, heck, like, Tim, I'm going to take you out for a beer because you're weird and you're awesome. I never would have had this conversation with you if not for this, right?
You all heard that.
But this was a place where Bellevue was a place where you could do that.
Exactly.
You had the beer garden there. You had the church. You had the company. Mm-hmm. You had these institutions that bound people together. Mm-hmm.
And the community centers. And so they're like these structures where people could come together and just be themselves. Thank you, Pete, for guiding me back. Councilman, appreciate you.
Let me ask you, though, is part of that, and I want to ask these guys the same thing, but is part of that helping people understand their past, which you have a museum, which sort of by definition helps people understand where they're from? Is understanding the past in Bellevue something that brings people together?
That's a great question. Yes, because I was always kind of flip with history, and I hate to say that, because it's just like, yeah, but what about today? What are we going to do about today? There's so many things on fire today. Like, let's do that. But understanding where you came from, you feel less isolated. Like, it wasn't until, I don't know what event, I was like, wait, there's a Waters Turpin in Oxford, and he was a prolific Black writer and professor? Huh? Wait, Phyllis Wheatley was writing poetry? Are we kidding? So there's like a discovery process that happens when you start digging into history. But it's scary, right? Because there's so much of it. Where do you even start? But I think that, history is super important to understanding what needs to happen next. The saying that history repeats itself, like some of what I watched in this documentary, I was like, that seems familiar. So knowing where you came from will only ever help you better figure out where you're going against the needs of today. And that's what we want to do with the museum, is honor the stories, the multiple like family lineages that come from Bellevue and everything that entails from a first person perspective, not so much like photos on a wall. And then find a way to bring those narratives so that it provides a sense of place for the young people that are growing up here in Bellevue and in Talbot today.
So, Pete, you have been at the forefront of collections as a curator, historian. What has gone through, and maybe how has your thinking evolved as you've collected items that help tell us and inform us about the past? What role has that played at the museum, and how does that help us, think about where we need to be going as we go forward?
Well, what gets saved? What do people choose to save? How do people set aside something that says this is worthwhile? This is important to me. And then the next generation will say, what am I going to do with this? Maybe the museum will carry this memory forward for us. And so these things get collected at the museum. The challenge, of course, is to say, where are the gaps? Whose story isn't being told? What is not visible, and where can we find that? And so I think it has been, over the years, a democratizing process of looking for how do we make this collection more representative of the broad experience, not just of Talbot County, because we're a Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, of people around the bay. And because the story hasn't ended. This is still a living culture that we're collecting. How do we make sure that we're collecting those stories of us? What's going on today? Because I've been at this for long enough that things that we collected 20 years ago that felt like contemporary collecting, we now say, we're glad that we hung on to that. We're glad that we hung on, we're glad that we collected the stories of women in the crab picking industry in the late 1990s, because all these crab picking houses were shutting down and the watermen's wives weren't doing this work anymore. And the only businesses that were staying open because they were bringing in Mexican and Central American workers on H-2B visas. And that is the story today. We managed to do that at a moment in time. And now looking back on that, we feel fortunate. So the challenge, of course, in collecting this is always to say, well, what's important today that will carry this story forward?
If you don't mind me jumping in with a question, sure. Is there something that, like, as a curator, you're like, I wish people would save more of this, that is commonly overlooked?
He wishes we'd save everything.
I am the family pack rat, and I'm descended from a long line of pack rats. So my wife is trying to get me to let go of these things. It's a question that we always. There's no ready answer to that, of course, because we're always looking for what's important, and sometimes it only comes with the passage of time. One of the approaches in contemporary collecting has long been gather a bunch of stuff up, put it away for 20 years, and then evaluate. Well, that takes a lot of resources, and I don't really recommend that. It may be what my inclination is, but good grief.
So, Tim, I have a little politics in my background, and one of the things I've always enjoyed are focus groups, because you get a few people together and you can learn a lot. It strikes me that, like, every day in the shop there is a focus group. You're dealing with people and you're learning what they're interested in over time. So I'm curious, what's your take on what people are interested in today about the past?
Another good question. I think things are always changing. They're always evolving. People today, at least in my shop, are more interested in social justice types of things. I used to be able to sell the heck out of Civil War. It's been popular for 100-something years, and it was like printing money if you have it. But these days, with the increase in interest in social justice causes, Civil War has kind of fallen out of favor. So it is always changing. And I agree with Pete, if you save stuff thinking it's going to go up in value, the exact opposite is going to happen. All right, in my business, because I deal in rare books and I deal in historic newspapers and so forth, I'm very thankful that people throw shit away. So, how many people were saving Beanie Babies? Oh, this is going to be worth $1 million one day. Well, of course, because everybody saved it, it's worth nothing. So,
Well, I'll throw away my Beanie Babies. Thanks, Tim.
The Man on the Moon newspapers, the FDR death, the Kennedy death newspapers, those are all, for the most part, they're pretty worthless. So, because everybody saved. Whereas the things that people threw away, that becomes the thing that becomes valuable. So, Pete, throw that stuff away.
We're approaching the point where we need to wrap this up. I wanted to read a quote and then give each of you a chance to reflect a little bit on it in terms of where we're heading. The quote, it's a comment about this program. The revolution's enduring struggle was and remains the balance between power and liberty. The founders assumed Americans would be citizens, not subjects, active participants, not passive recipients. Do you think going forward we're making progress in that regard?
I will say, if you look around Talbot County, that we are making progress on that front. If you look at don't just look at the structures of government, the number of people engaged in Easton Town government, in Oxford Town government, and Talbot County government, in all the boards and commissions and so forth, and who come out to testify at meetings and who engage and who vote, most importantly. I mean, Talbot County, have you looked at voter turnout in Talbot County? It's like around 80%. We get out, we engage in this county. But look beyond that. Look at all the people who volunteer. Look at what is happening through our food banks and through all the great variety of nonprofit organizations, hundreds of them in this community. Each of them, another one of these associations of people who have gotten together and who are making the community better around them. This is talking exactly about that type of participatory democracy. This is we the people doing the work of building our community.
What Pete said. No, could you read the quote one more time? I'm sorry.
You want to hear the quote is, the revolution's enduring struggle was and remains the balance between power and liberty. The founders assumed Americans would be citizens, not subjects, active participants, not passive recipients.
And
Mike up.
yes, sorry. Yes, thank you for rereading that. I think that there's a level of ownership that we all have, right? And in terms of how do I, as an individual, navigate the world that we're in? How do I, as an individual, navigate my family, my job, my community, the ripple effect of just living life? And I don't think any one of us really wants to just be like this passive thing that just floats through the ocean without any autonomy or say in what happens to us. But unless we come together, that's exactly what we'll be, because none of us can achieve what we really, I think, desire, like just on a human level, without the help of at least a couple of someone else. So that quote, to me, it speaks of what the American Revolution was about. It wasn't ever a destination. It was a direction. We haven't arrived at that place. We're still seeking it. And we've come so far, but there's still so far to go. And we've accomplished a lot across different communities and places and spaces. And I'm just really excited for the day when, that join or die comes together and we're all operating from a shared common ideal that might not reach all of us yet, but we are all willing to fight for. And that's America, y'all.
Well said. Thank you. Tim.
I think all throughout life, the spirit of the revolution, the ideas, the actions that they took back then are very similar to what we see today. The protests of the American Revolution before the Revolution from 1765 to 1775 were extremely violent. They were mob rule at times, and they didn't have the technology that we have. You couldn't see it streamed on your phone, 24 hours a day, but through that communication that we talked about earlier, the word got out, and if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, if you had your loyalties with the wrong people compared to the people around you, you were in serious danger. And you could be tarring and feathering was very popular at the time for putting people in their place. But if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could and would be killed. And I think that same violence that we saw back in the Revolution, as we've seen over the last week or so, and throughout many of these protests, the burning of the cities back in 2020 and so forth, they're very violent. I think that's human nature. So as it relates to history, I don't think we really do learn from it because we're human beings. We think we learn from it, we know it, we have the knowledge, but when our passions get aroused, just like they did back then, we tend to act in a mob rules kind of way. And that violence, because we're human, I don't think that'll ever stop.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Stephen Shupak and Maryland Public Television for bringing this production to our community. I want to thank the Avalon and the Spy for giving us this stage in which we can present some views and share them online in the future. Sarah, thank you for pulling this together with a great team. This concludes our evening. Ladies and gentlemen, thank these very articulate and courageous panelists. Thank you very much.